Okay, start with the springs. This one first. This is really good at getting away. I'm holding a toothpick over the centre so it can't spring off across the room. I pick up the tail of it with my tweezers, carry it over the top of that other spring and hook it behind this pin here. So this thing is now sprung loaded, this thing's now sprung loaded. Just checking that that spring is seated correctly. It is. That's good. Now the B lever. If I hold back that tab, slide the blade actuating ring forward, I can drop the B lever into position and it'll fall in towards the centre where it would lock the blade actuating ring. Its retaining spring is this one with the screw. This is a bit awkward to get into place because it wants to spring out of position. And how well focused this is, we'll have to wait and hope for the best. See if I can get this in. The spring is pushing the screw away from where I want it to go. I've got it started. Right, this spring needs to be carried back over the centre and it needs to be lifted over the top of that B lever. It drops into a notch at the bottom of the B lever. Do that screw up, check the B lever moves freely, springs back into place nicely. If I hold the B lever back with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the rest position. That's those two springs out of the way. That's a good start. Right, so we want the pallet wheel. Drop that in position, check it moves smoothly. We have the sector wheel here, this little lever with a sector gear on it. That drives the pallet wheel, so I want a touch of molybdenum paste on that. On the tail of it, on this little tab at the end, it's where it latches. Get that into position, swing that tab back, drop it in, that's okay, that's seated. Its spring is this one. I need to stretch that into position, I need my needle nose pliers to do that. Hook it over its post, stretch it out, hook it into that lever. So now if I pull this lever across, that will cock, locked into position. As the blade actuating ring opens, it releases this, drives the pallets. The B lever is dropped in. If I hold that back with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the rest position. That's good. Now the checking here is I've actually got a little bit of molybdenum paste. Let's cock this so I can see what I'm doing. Now there's a detent spring here. It runs against a post on the blade actuating ring. I just put a touch of molybdenum paste on that. That's moving nicely. On the blade actuating ring here is a little post, and opposite it here is another little post. They need to be lubricated. You need very little of this, you just need a touch of it. This detent spring here, I'm just putting a touch of molybdenum paste over that. And here, this is a settings lever for the flash sync and self timer. I run a wipe of molybdenum paste on that little ratchet teeth of that tab there. Now this can go into the back of the shutter. The pin comes up behind that spring. And if it's not seating correctly, it's probably against the spring instead of behind it. That's better. It's still sitting up. It's not sitting flat. Something not right there. Let me check that again. Not sure what's going on there. We'll check. It may just be that that spring is a little bit out of shape and it's pulling things across, which may or may not make any significant difference. We'll get the rest of this together and check its operation. That shim goes on there. The diaphragm setting lever goes here. And there are 3 small screws that hold that in position. That one was a bit reluctant to start. When you have multiple screws all identical and one of them seems a bit reluctant to start in one position, you can always try another screw there. It may be that the screw thread is slightly damaged. It may be that the thread is slightly damaged in the hole you're trying to get it screwed into. But if you're patient and don't force anything, usually things will go well. Well, I'm just checking the movement of this setting lever for the diaphragm. That appears to move quite smoothly, so I'm pleased with the state of that. This is of course a Retina IIC, so the diaphragm only opens up to f2.8. That's as far as it opens. It doesn't open up all the way. There's a stop here which prevents it from opening up any further. In fact, it's a rivet. I think it's actually on that side of the plate. Okay, so far so good. I can carry on putting the other components on the inside of the shutter. Right, I'll just put a wipe of molybdenum paste through this lever. That fits over its post. The spring has to be pushed against the inside of the case, so it's awkward to get into position, and you can't see what's happening through my non-transparent finger. That's okay, I can't see either. Fortunately, the lever knows what to do. Yeah, moving flash contact. If I cock this, I can put this cover in place. There's just something I've noticed there I don't like the look of. What's this? I think it's some... just a bit of grease. Yeah, that's sitting nicely in place. I'll find the appropriate screws. Plain screw at this end. We have a shoulder screw at the other end which also holds in place the spring. Need to make sure that that spring's free to revolve around the shoulder. You don't want it getting trapped underneath it or it won't work properly. Lift the tail of the spring up and bring it behind this arm, and it hooks into a little notch in the back of that arm. Now this is spring loaded. And this forms the catch for the main cam. And put the shutter release in position. I always put the briefest of wipes of molybdenum paste on the shaft of that. Fit this in position. The tab on this arm must come in underneath the B lever. The spring over here needs to be tucked down inside the case. You can see how when I press the shutter release it lifts this arm, which would release the main cam at this point. Okay, so far so good. Right, I've got the main cam here. This curved edge needs to have some molybdenum paste or similar applied to it. Usually I put a wipe through the centre and the two pickup points there and there. That's where it collects the blade actuating ring. I'll slide that down into position, move it round to the rest position, and I have the spring here. The little short leg on that drops into the hole on the main cam. And this end needs to be carried over and hooked behind the post at this point, which is difficult. It's easier when the springs are old and tired. Yeah, that spring is seated. If I cock the spring, you see it drop behind that arm. As I press the shutter release, the shutter fires. Put a wipe of molybdenum paste on that arm so that as it comes round it drops in easily. Do that again. Cock that, swing this round. That's fine. Now it needs the retard gear train and the self timer. Right, I've got the speed trains here. They've been through. Hang on, my main spring just jumped off then. To get that back where it belongs. Just uncock this. That's not something that can happen when the top's on the shutter. Get that spring hooked back round in position. No, that just come unhooked at the bottom again. Hang on. And my tweezers just don't have enough grip on this spring. What have I done to the tips of them? Oh, they look a little bit uneven. Yeah, it's hooked into position. Cock that. Put the retard gear train in place. Now it looks to me like the pin on this has been bent across, so we may need to muck about a bit to get the speeds correct. There are multiple ways you can adjust the speeds with a device like this. The position of the arm, which determines how much engagement the speed train has with the main cam. The start position is determined by this pin here against the speed settings cam plate. If that pin's bent in, it would speed the shutter up. If it's bent out, it would slow the shutter down. It's bent in. I think someone bent that in to speed the shutter up. Possibly because they hadn't done a thorough enough job of servicing it previously. But we'll find out. So the speeds at the retard gear train's in place, we should get 1 second or thereabouts. So if I hold back this lever, it will. Yeah, that didn't sound too bad. And the self timer is here. Both of these speed trains have been cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner in Naphtha, and everything all blown out, lubricated with a bit of graphite powder. That sounds pretty good. I think I can close that up and test the speeds. I'll need to put in place the pinion, speed settings cam plate, and this piece, the internal cocking piece. And it won't hurt to have the front retaining ring in place to stop things from wandering. I'll clean these pieces up. I've got these little pinion back in there. Make note of the position of the teeth here, because that's important. That's how they should be arranged. Over here you can see that the ring is behind the tab for the self timer. Now I can put the speed settings cam plate on that shutter and we should have a working shutter. I'll put the front retaining ring on just for convenience so it doesn't come apart while I'm trying to test things. And I'm interested to see what sort of speeds we get. This should be an 1/8 of a second. That didn't sound 100 miles away. That shutter sounds unnaturally quiet to me. Which is interesting. What's the 15th sound like? Yeah, that sounds credible. In 1 second. Okay, I'm going to go away and test these speeds and see what they're like. See if I need to make any changes to that shutter. If I don't need to straighten up that pin, then there's no point straightening that pin up, because every time you bend something to make an adjustment, you're one step closer to snapping it off, and there's no point looking for trouble. Well, with a bit of toing and froing of the position of the retard gear train, those speeds are now good. And I can put the this little lever in place here. This lever's job is to prevent you from being able to depress the shutter release if the shutter's not cocked. Just going to get this in position. Put the speed settings cam plate back in place. And put the retaining plate, the front retainer ring in place. Just loosely. That'll do nicely. Now this can go into the outer case. So the outer case is here. I've cleaned all this, cleaned the curved rack and the curved pusher. Just giving those a wipe of molybdenum paste. And get this lot together. Put the pusher in the case, slide that back out of the way, get the curved rack in there. You can see the position of that pusher right there. If I cock the shutter, I should be able to slide that into place. Now I should be able to rotate that into position. The flash contact sometimes doesn't want to fall into place. You've got to poke at it with a pair of tweezers like that. But that's good, that's all in place now. So I can put the 3 screws in place that hold the outer case to the inner case. The 2 countersunk head screws, the larger diameter one goes here. The smaller diameter one goes here. There's not much in it. I think probably one is 1.2 and the other one 1.4 millimeters, something like that. This little clamp screw on the side here just clamps the flash contact to make sure it's firm. You don't need to overdo that, it just needs to be snugged up and no more. And then we can close up the front of the shutter, which means getting all our control rings and so forth cleaned up and put back. Now some of the shutter is, I would say, unusually clean or unusually grease free, which means whoever serviced the shutter didn't lubricate things that should have been lubricated. and probably splashed around lubricants where they weren't needed. Just wipe this front piece here. These little notches form the detent for your shutter speeds. Normally that's lubricated with a bit of graphite grease or something. I find molybdenum paste does a neat and tidy job. And even if these parts are well lubricated when you take the shutter apart, you need to remove all that old lubrication and put fresh stuff there, because otherwise you'll be leaving behind any dust and grit that the old grease has gathered up. And that's one of the things that happens with grease, is it gathers up dust and grit, and what started off as a lubricant becomes a grinding paste, which is no good. Okay, those bits look okay. Start putting this together. To this piece, this is what couples the aperture setting lever on the shutter to the control rings. So I put a wipe of molybdenum paste on the underside of that and then drop that into position. That's because this rotates in here. That just lubricates that. And I can get this ring into position. A little tab here has to fall into the fork in the aperture setting here. The little notches at the top need to fall into the shutter speed setting cam plate here and here, both at the same time. The number ring here for the apertures, this is the repeater, this is just telegraphs the numbers to the top of the shutter. A little notch in the bottom drops over a tab on that inner ring. The front plate, these little notches need to be wiped with a bit of molybdenum paste or similar. That's what forms the detents for your shutter speed settings. We'll take this front ring off. Put this in place. It only fits in one position. It's got a little hole in the back which locks it in the correct position. The number plate should be off to the side. Put the front retaining ring back in place. See if I can get it started. That seems good. Run that down with a toothpick, check the settings. That seems a little bit tight. Back that off a little bit. Making sure that the detent for the shutter speed settings is good. Still seems a bit tight to me. Let's try it there. Oh yeah, that sounds better. And the little lock screw for the front retaining ring, put that into place. And that is the shutter. So I need to clean the lenses and put them back in place on the shutter.